December 14th, 1943, Baltimore, Maryland. Security Office, Bethlehem Steel Shipyard, Sparrows Point. The manila folder lay on the desk of Security Director Harlan Pritchard at precisely 8 o'clock in the morning. The envelope was standard government issue, brown, sealed with red wax, no return address visible through the small cellophane window. Only in the upper right corner, typed on what appeared to be an Underwood typewriter with a slightly worn ribbon, 3 words that carried particular weight in wartime America. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 0, underscore, underscore. 3 phrases that, in December of 1943, in the second year of American involvement in the global war, could end a career before the morning coffee grew cold, could destroy a reputation before lunch, could unravel a life before the evening shift change whistle blew across the gray waters of the Patapsco River. Pritchard opened the envelope at 8:47 when he had finished his first cup of coffee, black, no sugar, the way he'd drunk it since his Navy days in the last war. He read the letter once quickly, his eyes moving across the typed lines with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd read thousands of such documents. Then he read it again slowly, deliberately, returning to certain paragraphs, his finger tracing specific sentences. His face revealed nothing during this second reading. 20 years in naval intelligence during the Great War and 15 more years in corporate security had trained his features into perfect inscrutability when reviewing materials of this nature. The letter was long, 3 full pages, single-spaced, meticulously typed with what appeared to be multiple carbon copies, judging by the crispness of the impressions. Not a single strike-through, not one correction, not even a smudged letter. This wasn't the work of someone acting on sudden impulse or hot emotion. This was a document composed deliberately, over time, with calculation and forethought. Someone had drafted this, revised it, perhaps retyped it entirely to achieve this level of precision. Pritchard closed the folder carefully, aligned its edges with the corner of his desk blotter, a habit from his Navy years, placed it in the right drawer of his desk, and reached for the telephone. The black Bakelite handset was heavy in his palm, solid, real. He lifted the receiver and waited for the operator. He made 2 calls. The first to Special Agent Roger Milhouse at the FBI's Baltimore field office on Redwood Street. The conversation lasted 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Pritchard timed all such calls with the brass clock on his desk. The second call went to Gerald Hutchinson, Director of Personnel for Bethlehem Steel's Sparrows Point facility. That conversation was even briefer, 2 minutes and 43 seconds. Within 40 minutes of those 2 telephone calls, the fate of Dorothea Haverford was effectively decided, though the official mechanisms would take weeks to process. At that precise moment, 9:27 on the morning of December 14th, 1943, she sat at her drafting table on the 3rd floor of Bethlehem Steel's engineering building, reviewing stress calculations for Liberty ship hull sections, specifically examining the load distribution patterns for frames 47 through 52 on hull number J2847, which was scheduled for keel laying in January. She was using her good German-made drafting compass, the one her father had given her when she'd started at Johns Hopkins, its brass point still sharp after 6 years of daily use. The winter sunlight came through the tall industrial windows at an angle, illuminating the fine graphite lines on her vellum sheets. She was wearing her navy blue work dress, practical, with pockets for pencils and erasers, and her hair was pinned up in the efficient style she'd adopted since starting at the shipyard. Her hands moved with practiced precision across the calculations, checking figures, verifying load factors, ensuring that every rivet point, every weld seam, every structural member would bear the stresses it would face in the North Atlantic. She had no idea she'd already been condemned. That judgment had been passed without her participation, without her knowledge, without her voice being heard. In an empty office 3 buildings away, an office that smelled of stale Camel cigarettes and burnt Maxwell House coffee, behind a closed door with frosted glass that read, H.W. Pritchard, Security Director, in black sans serif letters, by a man who was neither her judge in any legal sense nor her personal enemy, merely a functionary executing the purpose for which the corporation and the government had positioned him. The machinery had been set in motion, the intricate, impersonal, bureaucratic machinery of wartime suspicion and security paranoia. And stopping it, once engaged, was impossible. The gears would turn. The procedures would be followed. The conclusion was already written, even if the specific details remained to be filled in. Dorothea Millicent didn't know that at exactly 12:15 that same day, while she sat in the engineering office eating her packed lunch, 2 sandwiches of last week's pot roast on rye bread, an apple from the vendor on Monument Street, a thermos of weak tea. Her neighbor, Constance Elaine Ridgway, was dining in the shipyard cafeteria, at a table near the windows overlooking the fitting-out pier, eating the Tuesday special of baked ham with scalloped potatoes and green beans, with the expression of someone who'd slept exceptionally well and was in excellent spirits, almost radiant in her satisfaction. To understand what happened to Dorothea Haverford, we must go back several months, to that summer when everything began. But to truly understand, we must go back even further, to understand who these people were before this story caught them in its machinery. Dorothea Millicent Haverford was born on March 17, 1918, in Baltimore, Maryland, in the modest but respectable home of her parents on North Charles Street, in the room that faced the back garden where her mother grew roses. She was born into the family of Theodore Wilhelm Haverford, a structural engineer who had himself been born in Baltimore in 1885 to German immigrant parents who'd arrived in America in 1881, part of that great wave of German immigration that had built half of Baltimore's breweries and a good portion of its manufacturing base. Theodore was one of those German-American professionals, methodical, precise, educated, who navigated both world wars with quiet dignity, cooperating with neither the hysteria of 1917 nor the paranoia of 1941 any more than survival required. He was a member of the American Society of Civil Engineers, attended meetings regularly, published occasional papers on bridge construction and building codes. He designed warehouses, factory buildings, the structural frames for commercial buildings throughout the Baltimore-Washington corridor. Dorothea's mother, Margaret Ann Haverford, née Chambers, had come from an old Maryland family, not wealthy but established, rooted in Baltimore for 4 generations. She had died young, in 1938, of pneumonia that turned to sepsis before the sulfa drugs could work their uncertain magic. Dorothea was 20 years old when her mother died, a sophomore at Johns Hopkins, already committed to following her father's profession. Dorothea grew up surrounded by her father's books and blueprints, with a habit of silence and precision that came from watching him work at his home drafting table in the evenings, the pool of light from his desk lamp creating a circle of concentration in the dim parlor, the scratch of his technical pen the only sound besides the ticking of the mantel clock. She learned to read architectural drawings before she learned to read music, learned to calculate load factors before she learned to balance a checkbook. In 1937, at 19, she enrolled in Johns Hopkins University's School of Engineering, one of only 3 women in her entering class of 64 students, the other 2 being Miriam Steinberg from Philadelphia and Dorothy Chen, whose father taught chemistry at Morgan State. The male students had been, not hostile exactly, but distant, skeptical. They didn't believe women belonged in engineering, believed it in the casual, unexamined way people believe things they've never questioned. Dorothea had proven them wrong through the simple expedient of being better than most of them. Her calculations were cleaner, her drawings more precise, her understanding of structural principles more intuitive. By her junior year, several of the men regularly asked to study with her before examinations, and Professor Millikan, who taught advanced structural analysis, had twice used her problem sets as examples for the class. In 1941, when everything changed, when the radio brought news of Pearl Harbor on that Sunday afternoon in December, when the country's trajectory shifted irrevocably, she had 1 semester remaining before graduation. She completed that semester in the spring of 1942 in a university that had already transformed itself for war, where half her male classmates had enlisted or been drafted, where the curriculum had been accelerated and refocused toward defense industry needs, where everything carried the urgency of national emergency. She received her diploma in May 1942, stood in a cap and gown in the spring sunshine, holding her rolled parchment certificate, and felt the weight of her father's absence. because by then, Theodore Wilhelm Haverford was already dead. He had died in February 1942, at his desk in his downtown office, slumped over a set of drawings for a warehouse in Canton. The doctor called it a massive heart attack. Myocardial infarction, the death certificate read. But Dorothea suspected it was something else. It was the accumulated stress of being German-American in a nation suddenly at war with Germany, of hearing whispers at engineering society meetings, of noticing how some clients now preferred other engineers, of reading his family name, Haverford, anglicized from Haberfeld 3 generations ago, and wondering if anyone else was reading it and thinking, underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, quote, underscore, underscore. The human heart can only sustain so much quiet anxiety before something gives way. Her husband, Andrew Michael Haverford, Theodore's nephew, which made him Dorothea's first cousin, a marriage arrangement that raised eyebrows but wasn't uncommon in those days, had been a machinist at Sparrows Point before the war. A kind man, quiet like Dorothea herself, good with his hands, patient with tools. They'd married in June 1940, a small ceremony at the First Presbyterian Church on Madison Street, just family and a few friends, Dorothea in her mother's wedding dress taken in at the waist. Andrew had enlisted in the Marines in January 1942, the day after his 30th birthday, before the draft could take him, wanting to choose his service. He'd shipped out in July, written letters faithfully through August and September, describing the heat of the Pacific, the strange beauty of tropical islands, the camaraderie of his unit. He died at Guadalcanal on November 15, 1942, killed by Japanese artillery fire during the final American push to secure Henderson Field. The telegram arrived on November 23rd, the Monday before Thanksgiving. Dorothea received it at the small apartment she shared with her daughter Eleanor on Monument Street, in the narrow brick row house with the white marble steps she scrubbed every Saturday morning in accordance with Baltimore tradition. Eleanor was 2 years old when her father died, born in September 1940, 3 months after the wedding. Too young to remember him except as a vague presence, a man in photographs, a Marine dress uniform hanging in the closet that smelled faintly of Old Spice and cigarette smoke. Dorothea was left alone with Eleanor, a widow at 24, an orphan, suddenly the sole support for herself and her daughter. But she belonged to that category of people whom circumstances might bend but not break. Not then, at least. Not in 1942, with the war still raging and work to be done, and a child depending on her. She worked. Hard, methodically, without loud proclamations about ambition or career. She had her engineering degree, had her father's reputation in the Baltimore engineering community to build upon, had her own proven competence. In June 1942, the same month Andrew shipped overseas, she was hired at Bethlehem Steel's Sparrows Point facility as a junior stress analyst. The country needed engineers desperately, needed every qualified person who could hold a slide rule and read a technical drawing. And gender mattered less when Liberty ships needed to be built at a rate of 3 per week, when the U-boats were sinking freighters faster than America could replace them. By late 1943, 18 months into her employment, she had advanced to senior stress analyst, a position that came with a substantial salary, $225 per month, more than twice what Andrew had earned as a machinist, and the respect of her colleagues. That respect was reserved but genuine. The men she worked with had learned she knew her business, that her calculations were reliable, that when Dorothea Haverford signed off on a structural analysis, the design was sound. She'd joined the United Steelworkers Union in early 1942, not from political conviction or ideological commitment, but because union membership provided certain protections, access to the work, a voice in the collective bargaining that determined wages and conditions. It was practical, like everything Dorothea did. In the union, she kept quiet, maintained the same low profile she'd cultivated at Hopkins, paid her dues regularly every month from her paycheck, attended meetings when required, voted when ballots came around, didn't make passionate speeches or serve on committees. She was exactly the kind of union member most were in those years, someone who simply lived and worked and kept her membership card in her coat pocket like a streetcar pass, without enthusiasm but without resentment, just another piece of paper that facilitated normal life. At the same shipyard, in the drafting department since October 1940, worked Constance Elaine Ridgway. About Constance Elaine Ridgway, we must speak separately and at length. Because people like her aren't monsters, not in the melodramatic sense of the word, not creatures of pure malice or cartoon villainy. There's something more ordinary, more banal, and therefore infinitely more terrifying. They're people who live next door, who say good morning on the stairs, who complain about the weather and the price of butter and the quality of the latest picture at the movie palace. They're people who function perfectly well in society, who hold jobs and raise children and pay their taxes and attend church on Sundays. And within that facade of ordinary normalcy, they carry something else, a capacity for casual cruelty, for calculated destruction, for acts of such cold-blooded selfishness that they seem scarcely human, yet are performed without apparent conscience, without hesitation, without subsequent remorse. Constance Ridgway was born on July 8, 1921, in Scranton, Pennsylvania, the second daughter of Harold and Ethel Whitmore. Her father worked as a freight clerk for the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad. Her mother took in sewing to supplement the family income during the Depression years. They were respectable working people, church-going Methodists, neither poor nor prosperous. Constance attended public schools, graduated from Scranton Central High School in 1939 with adequate but unremarkable grades. She'd taken the commercial course, typing, stenography, bookkeeping, preparing herself for office work, the standard path for working-class girls who didn't intend to become teachers or nurses. She came to Baltimore in September 1938, just 17, though she would turn 18 before the year ended, with her new husband, Vernon Ridgway, whom she'd married in August in a ceremony at the Methodist Chapel in Scranton. Vernon was 23, a supply sergeant in the Army who'd met Constance when he was stationed at Tobyhanna during summer training exercises, had courted her with the combination of military bearing and steady prospects that appealed to a young woman from a family where economic security was never guaranteed. Vernon had secured a civilian position with the Army Corps of Engineers in Baltimore, working in the procurement office, and the couple had moved south with high hopes and modest savings. They'd initially been given housing in a row house on Monument Street, the very street where Dorothea would later live, though 4 blocks farther east. A narrow slice of brick building divided into apartments, the kind of housing that proliferated in Baltimore's working-class neighborhoods. The apartment was small but adequate. Parlor, kitchen, bedroom, shared bathroom on the landing. Later, in 1941, when their first child was born, they moved to a slightly better house, still on Monument Street, but in a 3-story brick building with separate apartments, each with its own bathroom, steam heat included in the rent. Constance had found work as a junior draftsman at Bethlehem Steel in October 1940, part of the gradual ramp-up of defense production as Europe's war created increasing demands for American industrial output. She worked in the ship design office, making clean copies of engineering drawings, adding dimensions and notes, maintaining the filing system for technical specifications. By training and temperament, she was competent but unremarkable at this work. Nothing she produced over 3 years distinguished itself from the work of a dozen other junior draftsmen. She wasn't incompetent. Her drawings were accurate, her lettering neat, her filing systematic. But she possessed no special insight, no creative spark, no innovative approach that made senior engineers request her specifically for their projects. But she possessed another quality, a different kind of competence, a different specialty altogether. Constance Ridgway had phenomenal attentiveness to other people's lives, a near photographic memory for personal details, an instinct for observation that bordered on surveillance. She knew more about her neighbors, her co-workers, her fellow parishioners at Grace Methodist Church than they knew about themselves. She noticed who greeted whom on the street corner and who turned away first. She observed who received mail from who came home at what hour, who carried which packages, who wore new clothes and how often. She knew when Mrs. Kowalski on the 2nd floor bought her shoes. Every 18 months, brown Oxfords from the Hecht Company's annual sale. And she knew that Mr. Patterson from the 1st floor had his suit cleaned the 2nd Tuesday of every month at the Chinese Laundry on Charles Street. She remembered these things, cataloged them, filed them away in her remarkable memory with the same systematic precision she applied to blueprint filing at the shipyard. And this observation wasn't idle curiosity. It was purposeful. It was gathering intelligence. Constance understood, perhaps on some instinctive level she couldn't articulate, that information was power, that knowledge of other people's business could be leveraged, that the ability to observe and remember gave her a form of control in a world where she had little other power. People felt uncomfortable in her presence without quite knowing why. There was something about her gaze, attentive but not warm, focused but not friendly, that suggested she was constantly taking notes, mentally recording details for future reference. Women at church stopped sharing confidences when Constance was nearby. Men at the shipyard were careful about what they said in the cafeteria when she was within earshot. This wasn't because she was actively malicious in ordinary circumstances. She wasn't spreading gossip or making trouble on a daily basis, but because there was something in her demeanor that suggested she might, that the information she gathered was being saved for some purpose, that nothing said in her presence was truly private. In their building on Monument Street lived both the Ridgeways, on the third floor, apartment 12, and the Haverfords, Dorothea and young Eleanor, on the second floor, apartment 7. 3 stories of brick, narrow staircases, the hallways smelling of what every Baltimore row house hallway smelled of in those years. Yesterday's cabbage from German cooking, Mrs. Kowalski's cat box that was never quite clean enough, cigarette smoke from Mr. Patterson's evening Lucky Strikes, the damp wool smell of winter coats hanging on hooks by apartment doors. Dorothea and Constance weren't friends, had never been friends, had no particular reason to become friends. They nodded on the stairs when they passed, sometimes exchanged brief words about the weather or ration stamps or the news from Europe. Standard neighborly relations in a wartime American city, not intimacy but not hostility, just the minimal social lubricant that allowed strangers sharing a building to coexist without friction. This continued without incident from June 1942, when Dorothea moved in, through all of 1943, until that November. But before describing what happened in November 1943, we must mention one more crucial circumstance. We must understand what Constance Ridgway did better than anything else in her life. What was her real talent? Perhaps the only genuine talent she possessed, certainly the only one she would employ with such devastating effect. She knew how to observe, and she knew how to remember, and she knew how to wait. For years, if necessary. In October 1940, when Constance first started at Bethlehem Steel, she went through the standard orientation period that all new employees experienced, meeting colleagues, learning procedures, understanding work protocols, being shown where to file drawings, how to use the blueprint duplicating machine, when to take coffee breaks. But Constance, during this orientation period, did something that other new employees didn't do, something that revealed the particular cast of her mind. When she was being trained in the filing procedures by Mrs. Hargrove, the Personnel Department secretary, and happened to have legitimate access to old employee files as part of learning the system, she read them. Not just glanced at them, read them carefully. Read not just the technical information about job classifications and pay grades, but the personal information. The home addresses, the family circumstances, the previous employment, the educational backgrounds, the references, the emergency contacts. And specifically, she read the section that every defense industry employee had to complete in 1940 and 1941. Foreign contacts and relatives. This was standard procedure as America prepared for possible war, as the government became increasingly concerned about potential sabotage, as the FBI compiled lists and opened files. Every employee had to list any relatives in foreign countries, any correspondence with foreign nationals, any trips abroad in the past 10 years, any membership in organizations with international affiliations. Most people had nothing to report, just a dash, a blank, none, written in clear letters. But some people had entries. A cousin in Ireland, an uncle in Poland, a sister who'd married a Canadian, a business correspondence with a supplier in Brazil. All innocent, all disclosed, all proper, but documented, recorded, filed away in manila folders in locked file cabinets in the personnel office. Constance read these files whenever she had access to them, which was frequent in her first 6 months as she learned the filing systems. She didn't take notes. That would have been obvious, potentially problematic. She simply read and remembered. Her memory was exceptional for this type of information, the way some people have perfect pitch or photographic memory for faces. She could read a personnel file once and recall its contents months or years later with remarkable accuracy. She read Dorothea Haverford's personnel file in July 1942, a month after Dorothea was hired. It was a routine new employee file review. Constance's job involved updating certain filing indices, and she happened to pull Dorothea's folder along with 24 others. The file was neat, properly completed, unremarkable in most respects. Dorothea's background check had cleared without issues. Her references from Johns Hopkins were excellent. Her technical qualifications were clearly superior. Her work history, though brief due to her age, was solid. The security questionnaire section showed appropriate responses to all standard questions. But Constance noticed something. In her father's old records, Theodore Haverford's file, which was cross-referenced because he'd done contract engineering work for Bethlehem Steel in the 1930s, there was a notation from a 1938 background check when he'd bid on a Navy facility project. The notation mentioned that Theodore had distant relatives in Stuttgart, Germany, cousins on his father's side, the Haberfeld branch that had remained in Germany when Theodore's grandparents emigrated in 1881. Contact with this branch had ceased in 1933, according to the notation, and there was no suggestion of any impropriety. The notation existed purely for thoroughness, the kind of detail that conscientious background investigators recorded and filed away. Dorothea's own file didn't mention these German relatives. Why would it? The form asked about the applicant's foreign contacts, not deceased parents' distant cousins. Dorothea had truthfully indicated none. She had no foreign contacts, hadn't corresponded with German relatives she'd never met, had no connection to Germany beyond her surname's etymology. Her answer was completely accurate and proper. But Constance, reading both files, noted the discrepancy. Not a discrepancy in truth, but a discrepancy in documentation. Theodore's old file mentioned German relatives. Dorothea's file didn't. Constance committed this to memory. Not to a written notebook, she was too careful for that, but to her remarkable mental filing system, the same system that remembered who bought shoes when and who received mail from whom. She didn't know how this information might prove useful, but she understood that it might. People who observe as Constance observed develop an instinct for this, an instinct for what information might have future value, what details might someday be leveraged. She filed this knowledge away and waited. For 3 years and 4 months, she waited. And then, in November 1943, the moment arrived. The catalyst was simple, banal, almost ridiculous in its insignificance. In November 1943, the drafting department was restructured. Several senior positions were being reclassified due to new Navy contract requirements, and the department had announced that 2 senior draftsman positions, a step up in both responsibility and salary, would be filled through internal promotion. Constance applied. Of course she applied. She'd been there since October 1940, 3 years of loyal service, competent work, no complaints. By seniority and steady performance, she believed herself entitled to consideration, perhaps even the front runner. She'd already mentally spent the salary increase. A new winter coat from Hutzler's, new school shoes for the children, perhaps even moving to a better neighborhood. The positions were announced on November 18, 1943. Neither went to Constance. One went to Harold Brenner, a draftsman who'd been there since 1939. The other went to a newer employee, someone who'd been recommended by the engineering department for exceptional work on a recent complex project. That newer employee was Dorothea Haverford. It wasn't favoritism. It wasn't bias. It was purely merit-based. Dorothea wasn't even officially in the drafting department. She was a stress analyst in engineering. But the position involved liaison work with engineering, and the department head had asked engineering for recommendations. Dorothea's supervisor had recommended her enthusiastically. She'd accepted the lateral transfer, which came with the senior draftsman classification and the salary increase. It was a natural career move, a reasonable promotion for someone of evident capability. But Constance saw it differently. Constance saw someone who'd been at Bethlehem Steel for barely 18 months, leapfrogging over someone who'd served loyally for 3 years. Saw a younger woman. Dorothea was 25, Constance 22, but Constance perceived herself as more mature, more deserving, being rewarded while she was overlooked. Saw what she interpreted as profound injustice, and in that moment of disappointment and resentment, Constance made her decision. She would correct this injustice. She would level this playing field. She would use the one weapon available to people like her, the weapon that required no special skills beyond observation, memory, and a capacity for ruthlessness disguised as civic duty. She would write a letter. The letter was composed over the course of 10 days, from November 20th through November 30th, 1943. Constance worked on it during evenings when Vernon was out at his regular Thursday night poker game and his Tuesday bowling league, when the children were asleep, when she had privacy and quiet. She drafted it longhand first, on sheets of notepaper, crossing out and revising, building her case with the methodical precision she brought to blueprint filing. She wasn't writing in hot anger. This wasn't an impulsive denunciation scrawled in fury. This was calculated, cold, strategic. She was constructing a document that would achieve a specific purpose: the destruction of Dorothea Haverford's employment, her reputation, her security clearance, her future in defense work. The final version, typed neatly on Vernon's Underwood typewriter using fresh ribbon, ran to 3 full pages. It was addressed __quote_9__ at Bethlehem Steel Security Office and marked quote 10. Quote. It began formally, quote 11. Quote. Then came the accusations, presented in numbered paragraphs, each carefully crafted to seem specific enough to be credible, but vague enough to be difficult to disprove. First, __, quote _1 2 __. This was entirely fabricated. There was no man. Dorothea lived quietly with Eleanor, followed a strict routine. Work, home, Eleanor, sleep. The __, quote _13 __. Constance claimed to have heard didn't exist, but this type of accusation was perfect for its purpose, impossible to prove or disprove definitively, playing on social prejudices about widows and moral conduct, implying without stating anything actionable. Second, Mrs. Haverford has on several occasions made disparaging comments about American engineering and manufacturing standards, suggesting that German methods and designs are superior. Specifically, in a meeting I attended in August 1943, she referenced German ship construction techniques in a tone that suggested admiration rather than purely technical analysis. While such comments might seem innocuous in isolation, in the context of her family background, see below, they raise questions about her loyalties and sympathies. This was a distortion approaching fiction. Dorothea had indeed made a technical reference to Bremen-class liner construction, a single factual engineering observation in a design discussion about hull reinforcement patterns. The liners were German. The technique was documented in engineering journals. The reference was purely professional. But Constance had been present at that meeting, in her capacity as recording secretary, had noted the comment, and now transformed it into evidence of admiration for German methodology, colored it with innuendo about divided loyalties. Third, I have learned through reliable sources that Mrs. Haverford's family maintains connections to relatives in Germany. While I cannot speak to whether Mrs. Haverford currently corresponds with these relatives, the existence of such familial ties during wartime, combined with the behaviors noted above, raises serious security concerns. Her failure to disclose these connections in her employment application suggests possible deliberate concealment. This was the most insidious accusation because it contained a seed of truth wrapped in layers of deception. Yes, Theodore Haverford's old file mentioned distant German cousins. But quote 18, false. Quote 19, misleading, as Dorothea's application form asked about her contacts, not her deceased father's distant relatives from 60 years ago. Quote 20 __. Pure innuendo, transforming a non-existent omission into evidence of espionage intent. The letter concluded, quote 21 __. The letter was not signed. Constance had considered signing it. Anonymous letters carried less weight, but ultimately decided that the detail and specificity of the accusations would lend credibility even without a signature, and anonymity would protect her from any awkward questions. She typed the final version on December 8, 1943, Pearl Harbor Day, a darkly appropriate coincidence. Made 3 carbon copies for her own records, sealed the original in a brown envelope, addressed it to quote 22 __. Added no return address. On Friday morning, December 10, 1943, she walked to the post office on Pratt Street. Not the neighborhood postal station where she was known, but the main downtown office where she was anonymous, and mailed the letter. First-class postage. Dropped it in the slot. Watched it disappear into the institutional mail system. Then, she walked to Hutzler's department store, browsed the winter coat sale, bought herself lunch at the lunch counter, and went home. She made dinner for Vernon and the children, played with the baby, listened to the evening radio programs, went to bed and slept soundly, dreamlessly, without a tremor of conscience. The letter arrived at Harlan Pritchard's office on Monday, December 13, 1943, in the afternoon mail delivery. It sat in his incoming correspondence tray overnight. He opened it the following morning at 8:47, read it twice, made his 2 phone calls, and set in motion the machinery that would destroy Dorothea Haverford's life. The investigation that followed was neither dramatic nor swift. There were no midnight arrests, no harsh interrogations under bright lights, no scenes from the detective pictures playing at the Hippodrome Theater. This was America in 1943, not occupied Europe. The process was civilized, bureaucratic, procedural, which made it no less destructive, merely more insidious, more difficult to resist, more impossible to stop once started. The mechanism worked like this. First, on December 16, 1943, Dorothea's security clearance was quote 23 __. This was presented to her as a purely administrative matter, temporary, routine, nothing to be alarmed about. Quote 24 __. She was immediately reassigned from her stress analysis work, which required access to classified hull designs, armor plating specifications, and other sensitive technical data, to general administrative support in the blueprint archive. A demotion in everything but official terminology. Her salary remained the same, technically, but the interesting work stopped. The professional recognition stopped. The respect of engineering colleagues, who now saw her shuttling filing boxes instead of reviewing calculations, began to erode. Second, her neighbors were interviewed. This happened over the course of late December and early January, conducted by a man who identified himself as quote 25 __. He was actually FBI Special Agent Roger Milhouse, working undercover as part of the wartime domestic intelligence program. He interviewed Mrs. Kowalski on the second floor, quote 26 quote 27, quote 28, quote 2030, quote 31. He interviewed Mr. Patterson on the first floor, similar questions on the non-answers. He interviewed 3 other neighbors in the building. Most neighbors knew nothing because there was nothing to know. Dorothea lived quietly, worked long hours, spent her non-work time with Eleanor, had no mysterious visitors, engaged in no suspicious activities. But the very fact of being interviewed, of having a government investigator asking questions about you, planted suspicion. Mrs. Kowalski, who'd always greeted Dorothea pleasantly on the stairs, now nodded more coolly, watched more carefully. Human nature. If the government is asking questions about someone, there must be a reason. Smoke suggests fire. Third, Her personnel file and background were reviewed in exhaustive detail. FBI agents, working with Bethlehem Steel Security, with full access to company records, examined every aspect of her application, her employment history, her educational background. They interviewed former professors at Johns Hopkins, all of whom spoke highly of her technical abilities, found nothing concerning. They interviewed former neighbors from her previous address. They pulled Theodore Haverford's old contract files and found the notation about German relatives. This notation became the foundation of the _32 accusation. Never mind that Dorothea's application had asked about her foreign contacts, and she'd truthfully answered _33. Never mind that these were her deceased father's distant cousins she'd never met. Never mind that the last contact between any Haverford and any Haberfeld had been in 1933, 10 years earlier. The existence of the information in one file and its absence in another file was characterized as a _34_, and discrepancies suggested concealment, and concealment suggested intent, and intent suggested disloyalty. Fourth, her work comments and professional interactions were scrutinized. Every meeting she'd attended over 18 months, every technical discussion, every casual conversation in the cafeteria was examined through the lens of suspicion. The single reference to Bremen-class liner construction, that innocent technical observation in August, was located in meeting minutes, highlighted, interpreted as expressing admiration for German engineering in a manner suggesting possible sympathy with enemy methods. Colleagues were interviewed. Did Mrs. Haverford ever make comments suggesting German sympathies? Most said no, absolutely not. She was thoroughly professional. But one draftsman, trying to be helpful, trying to remember something, anything relevant, recalled that she'd once mentioned her father had been born in Baltimore to German immigrant parents. Quote, 37. Quote, he added hastily. Quote, 38. Quote, but it went into the file. German heritage, another data point. The investigation found no actual evidence of espionage, of sabotage, of genuine disloyalty. How could it? None existed. Dorothea was exactly what she appeared to be, a competent engineer, a widow, a mother, an ordinary American woman doing her part for the war effort. But the investigation's purpose wasn't to find evidence. Evidence would have led to criminal charges. Its purpose was to determine, quote, 39, which was a far lower threshold, a judgment call, a matter of whether someone's continued employment posed any possible theoretical danger to national security. And in wartime 1944, with U-boats off the Atlantic coast, with sabotage fears inflamed by government propaganda posters, loose lips sink ships, the enemy is listening. With the memory of Pearl Harbor still raw, the calculus favored extreme caution. Doubt favored security over fairness. Suspicion, however baseless, outweighed an individual's career or reputation. The man who'd visited Dorothea's apartment, the mysterious late-night visitor mentioned in Constance's letter, was the hardest accusation to address because you cannot prove a negative. Dorothea truthfully said no such person existed. Neighbors, when pressed, admitted they'd never actually seen such a person. But the investigative logic ran. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. The fact that neighbors hadn't seen him didn't prove he didn't exist, merely that Dorothea was discreet, which was itself suspicious. Why such discretion unless there was something to hide? By mid-January 1944, the file was complete. Special Agent Milhouse compiled his report, 17 pages single-spaced, documenting interviews, background checks, timeline reconstructions. The report's conclusion was carefully worded. While no direct evidence of espionage or sabotage activity has been discovered, the totality of circumstances, unverified reports of questionable associations, documented German family connections not disclosed on current employment application, statements suggesting possible admiration for enemy methodology, raises sufficient concern regarding subject suitability for continued security clearance. Recommend termination of clearance and employment in sensitive defense work. The report landed on Gerald Hutchinson's desk in personnel on January 17, 1944. He read it that afternoon, made his decision by 5 p.m. The corporate lawyers had reviewed the case. Terminating someone on security grounds was legally permissible, provided proper procedure was followed. Documentation was adequate. Risk exposure to the company was minimal. The decision was clear. On Tuesday, January 18, 1944, at 3:15 p.m., Dorothea Millicent Haverford was summoned to Harlan Pritchard's office. She walked across the shipyard from the blueprint archive, climbed the stairs to the security office, knocked on the frosted glass door, entered when called. Pritchard was standing behind his desk. He didn't offer her a seat. The conversation took 6 minutes. Dorothea stood very still. She unpinned the badge from her dress, set it on his desk. Her hands were steady. Her voice was steady. Only her eyes betrayed the shock, the incomprehension, the beginning of something that might become anger or might become despair. Quote 50, she said quietly. Quote 51. Quote 52. She left his office, walked back across the shipyard one final time, collected her personal items from her desk in the blueprint archive, a framed photograph of Eleanor, her father's old German compass, a coffee mug, 3 technical books, packed them in a small cardboard box, and walked out through the guard gate at 3:47 p.m. on January 18, 1944. It was snowing lightly, wet January snow that melted on contact with the pavement. She wore her good gray wool coat, the one Andrew had bought her for Christmas in 1941, before he shipped out, the last gift he'd given her. Her purse contained her final paycheck, $187.50 for 2 weeks' work plus accumulated vacation, and the small framed photograph of Eleanor at age 2, laughing at something beyond the camera's frame, her whole life ahead of her, unknowing and bright. Dorothea took the streetcar home, the number 10 that ran from Sparrows Point to downtown Baltimore, standing in the crowded afternoon car among shipyard workers heading home for dinner, men and women still wearing their badges, still employed, still part of the vast industrial machinery building ships and weapons for a war that would be won, in large part, by people like them doing work like theirs. She climbed the 3 flights of stairs to apartment 7 on Monument Street, unlocked the door, sat at the kitchen table in her coat, still holding the cardboard box as the winter afternoon faded to dusk. She remained sitting there, not moving, barely breathing, for nearly 2 hours, until Eleanor returned at 5:30 from Mrs. Henderson's apartment downstairs, where she stayed after school until her mother came home from work. Eleanor burst in with 5-year-old energy, talking about her day, about the picture she'd drawn, about the new girl at school. Then she stopped, seeing her mother's face, the box on the table. "Mommy?" Dorothea stood, set the box aside, smiled, forced it but achieved it. "Hello, sweetheart. How was school?" "What's in the box?" "Just some things from my office. I'm going to be working somewhere else now. Nothing to worry about." She heated soup, Campbell's vegetable, from a can purchased with carefully hoarded ration stamps, and made grilled cheese sandwiches with the last of the week's butter allowance. Fed Eleanor. Bathed her. Read her a story. The Little Engine That Could. Eleanor's favorite. Put her to bed with the stuffed rabbit Andrew had won at the state fair in 1940, a lifetime ago. Only after Eleanor was asleep, only after the apartment was quiet except for the hiss of the radiator and the distant sound of traffic on Monument Street, only then did Dorothea allow herself to cry. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands over her face, shoulders shaking with silent sobs, crying with a grief that was equal parts shock and rage and incomprehension and fear. Fear most of all. Fear of what came next, of how to provide for Eleanor, of what this termination meant for her future, for any future. She cried for 23 minutes. Then she stopped, washed her face in the kitchen sink with cold water, made tea with one of her carefully rationed tea bags, sat at the table with the hot cup warming her hands, looked around the small apartment, looked at the framed diploma on the wall, Johns Hopkins University, Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering, May 1942. Looked at the photograph of Andrew in his marine dress uniform, taken at Paris Island before deployment, young and proud and doomed. Looked at Eleanor's small blue coat hanging on the hook by the door, the mittens stuffed in its pockets. Made a decision. Simple, clear, necessary. She would survive. She would provide for Eleanor. She would endure. She would not break. Not now. Not ever. Whatever it took. What followed over the next 16 years was not the dramatic destruction Constance Ridgway might have imagined or intended. It was slower, quieter, more corrosive. It was the gradual erosion of possibilities, the narrowing of horizons, the transformation of a professional engineer into a series of increasingly diminished clerical positions. Dorothea couldn't find engineering work. Her termination from Bethlehem Steel, though officially characterized as merely a security clearance issue, carried the taint of suspicion. Other defense contractors, when they checked references, heard carefully worded warnings. Quote, _58, quote. In wartime America, this was enough. No one wanted risk. No one wanted trouble. No one wanted to hire someone who'd been let go from defense work for any reason touching security, however vaguely. Civilian engineering firms, the few that still existed, that hadn't converted entirely to war production, weren't hiring new engineers. Every trained engineer was already working for the war effort. There was no civilian construction, no private architectural work, no building projects beyond essential infrastructure. The economy had been completely mobilized for war. So Dorothea found what work she could. She started as a bookkeeper at Brenner's Hardware on Eastern Avenue, $85 per month, less than half her Bethlehem Steel salary, posting accounts, managing inventory, ordering stock. She was wildly overqualified, could do the work in her sleep, but it was employment. It was steady. It provided income. That lasted 9 months, until Mr. Brenner's nephew returned from the Navy and needed a job, and family came first. Dorothea was let go in October 1944, given 2 weeks severance and a polite letter of reference. Next came a position as a file clerk at Continental Insurance on Lexington Street, $70 per month, even less than the hardware store, organizing policy documents, maintaining filing systems, typing correspondence. She worked there for 18 months, until the end of the war brought veterans home, and the company preferentially hired returning servicemen. Her position was eliminated in August 1946. Then, a secretarial position at a law firm on Charles Street. Then, a billing clerk at a medical practice. Then, another filing job at a shipping company. Each position paid less than the one before, or paid the same but demanded more hours. Each position was temporary or precarious. Each position was so far below her capabilities that it would have been laughable if it weren't tragic. By 1950, Dorothea and Eleanor had moved 3 times, each time to smaller, cheaper apartments. They left Monument Street in 1945 for a 1-bedroom on Federal Street. Eleanor sleeping in the bedroom, Dorothea on a fold-out couch in the parlor. Then to an efficiency apartment in 1947. Then to a boarding house room in 1949, sharing a bathroom down the hall with 4 other families. Eleanor wore hand-me-down clothes from charity collections. Dorothea mended stockings until they couldn't be mended anymore. They ate economically: beans, rice, cheap cuts of meat stretched over multiple meals, vegetables from the reduced-price bin at the corner grocer. Not starving, never starving, but always calculating, always careful, always conscious of the gap between income and necessities. But Dorothea didn't break. She kept Eleanor clean, kept her fed, kept her in school, made sure Eleanor's homework was done, her shoes were polished, her hair was brushed. Maintained appearances. Maintained dignity. Went to work every day precisely on time, did her assigned tasks competently, spoke politely to supervisors and colleagues, never complained, never explained, never asked for sympathy or help. What broke, what shattered, was something harder to name or measure. Her faith in institutional fairness, perhaps. Her belief that competence and honesty were sufficient protection. her capacity for trust in systems, in authorities, in the promises of merit and justice. She stopped smiling except when Eleanor was watching, stopped initiating casual conversation with neighbors or coworkers, became quieter, more careful, more withdrawn. Not bitter. Bitter would have suggested she still expected something different, still believed the world owed her justice. She'd moved past that. She'd accepted a grimmer truth, that the world was arbitrary, that destruction could come without reason, that survival required constant vigilance and no emotional waste. The light in her eyes, the brightness that had shone in photographs from 1941, the engaged intelligence that colleagues at Bethlehem Steel had noticed and respected, dimmed year by year. Not extinguished, but banked, conserved, redirected toward the sole purpose that mattered, keeping Eleanor safe, fed, educated, protected from the knowledge of how badly their lives had been damaged. Eleanor, growing through these years, noticed things children notice. Noticed how carefully her mother counted change. Noticed how the apartment kept shrinking. Noticed how her mother's hands, once steady over drafting tools, now trembled slightly when tired from typing invoices. Noticed how, when they rode the bus past Sparrows Point, past the great industrial complex where the shipyard sprawled along the harbor, her mother would turn her face toward the window and go silent. Children notice and remember, even when they don't understand the complete story, even when parents work hard to shield them from the worst. Meanwhile, in those same years, Constance Elaine Ridgway prospered. With Dorothea eliminated from competition, removed from Bethlehem Steel, removed from defense work entirely, Constance received the promotion she'd believed was her due. In March 1944, 2 months after Dorothea's termination, Constance was elevated to senior draftsman. The position came with a salary increase to $165 per month, a small private desk instead of the shared drafting tables, her name on inter-office memoranda. Vernon received his own promotions through the war years and after, supply sergeant to procurement specialist to contracts manager. By 1948, his salary had reached $285 per month. Combined with Constance's income, the family was solidly middle class, comfortable, secure. They moved in 1946 to a much better house in Hampton, a full 3-bedroom with a yard, a garage, modern kitchen appliances. Purchased a new Frigidaire in 1947, a television set in 1949, one of the first on their block, a handsome Philco console that became a point of pride. A new DeSoto automobile in 1951, pale blue, with white wall tires and a radio. Their children, 3 by 1950, attended good public schools, wore new clothes purchased from Hochschild Kohn department store, took music lessons. The Ridgways joined Grace Methodist Church in Hampton, attended regularly, contributed to the building fund, participated in potluck suppers and mission committees. Constance never spoke of the letter. Not to Vernon, who knew nothing about it. Not to anyone. It was her secret, the one genuinely successful thing she'd accomplished entirely through her own initiative, her own strategic thinking. She never felt guilt about it. Why would she? She'd corrected an injustice in her view, had leveled a playing field that had been unfairly tilted toward someone less deserving, had done what was necessary in a competitive world where nice people finished last. She slept well every night, had no nightmares, no intrusive thoughts, no moments of doubt. People like Constance Ridgway don't experience guilt because they don't perceive their actions as wrong. They experience satisfaction at having successfully navigated a system, having deployed available tools effectively, having achieved desired outcomes through permitted means. In December 1947, 3 years almost to the day after writing the letter, Constance happened to see Dorothea downtown on Charles Street, near the department stores. It was a Saturday afternoon, the holiday shopping season, the streets crowded with people carrying packages and looking in decorated windows. Constance was shopping for a new winter coat at Hutzler's. She'd just purchased a beautiful camel hair coat, marked down to $47 from $65. Still expensive, but affordable now, a luxury she could justify. She was walking toward the store exit, her new coat in a Hutzler's shopping bag, when she saw Dorothea on the sidewalk outside. Dorothea was thinner than Constance remembered, grayer though she was only 29 years old, wearing a coat that had clearly seen many winters, walking with a small girl, Eleanor, now 7, carrying a single modest shopping bag from Woolworth's, the 5 and dime. They made eye contact for 1 second, perhaps 2. Dorothea's face showed recognition, then something else. Not hatred, not rage, something more complex and more terrible. A kind of bleak comprehension, as if in that moment she understood something about the universe's fundamental unfairness, about how some people destroy others and prosper while their victims diminish. Constance looked away first, a purely instinctive reaction, then immediately felt annoyed at herself for the weakness. She continued into Hutzler's, browsed the hat department, bought herself a new felt cloche with a satin ribbon, went home thoroughly satisfied with her purchases. She never thought about that encounter again. Why would she? It meant nothing. Dorothea Haverford was nothing to her, just a former neighbor, a former co-worker, someone whose path had diverged from Constance's own upward trajectory. Their lives had no further intersection. Eleanor Haverford grew up to become a different kind of woman than her mother, though in some ways exactly the same. She inherited Dorothea's precision, her quiet strength, her capacity for methodical work, her refusal to surrender to circumstances. But she chose a different path, different tools for engaging with the world. Eleanor decided to become a journalist. The decision crystallized during her senior year at Eastern High School in 1957. She'd been working part-time since age 14, delivering newspapers, working as a stock girl at Woolworth's, babysitting, saving money for college, because there was no question she would attend college, would build something better than her mother's diminished life. She'd watched her mother work in positions far beneath her capabilities for her entire conscious memory. She'd understood by 16 that something terrible had happened to her mother, something connected to that box of belongings from Bethlehem steel that still sat in their current apartment's closet, that Dorothea had never explained beyond saying, __quote_59__. Eleanor had discovered journalism through the high school newspaper, found she had an aptitude for investigation, for asking uncomfortable questions, for assembling facts into narratives that revealed patterns others missed. She was good at it. Better than that, it felt right, felt like purpose. She applied to the University of Maryland's journalism program in fall 1958, was accepted with a partial scholarship based on her grades and her impressive portfolio of high school newspaper work. She worked nights throughout college, waitressing at a diner on Route 1, typing papers for other students, any legitimate employment she could find, to pay tuition and fees that the scholarship didn't cover. She lived at home to save money, commuted to College Park on the bus, studied in library corners and empty classrooms, graduated in May 1959 with a 3.7 GPA and a journalism degree. Dorothea attended the graduation ceremony, sitting in the bleachers at the university stadium, watching her daughter receive her diploma. It was May 24, 1959, a warm Sunday, the stadium filled with proud families, the graduates in their caps and gowns processing across the stage to __quote_60__. Dorothea was 41 years old, looked 50, worn down by 16 years of work that had slowly ground away her vitality. But that day she showed genuine pleasure, genuine pride, her face brightening in a way Eleanor rarely saw, her smile reaching her eyes for perhaps the first time in years. That was the last time Eleanor saw her mother truly happy. 6 months later, it happened very quickly the way these things sometimes do, Dorothea fell ill. A cold in December 1959 that wouldn't clear, that settled into her chest, that became pneumonia despite the antibiotics Dr. Morrison prescribed. She was admitted to Johns Hopkins Hospital on January 8, 1960. The pneumonia was severe, complicated by exhaustion, by a weakened immune system from years of inadequate nutrition and excessive stress, by what the doctors delicately termed general debilitation. Eleanor visited every day, sitting by her mother's bedside, holding her hand, talking about nothing important, the weather, the headlines, the new reporter position Eleanor had just accepted at the Baltimore Sun. Dorothea listened, sometimes responded, sometimes just squeezed Eleanor's hand to show she was present. She was hearing. She was still there. On January 17, 1960, exactly 16 years to the day after her termination from Bethlehem Steel, though neither Eleanor nor Dorothea consciously noted the anniversary, Dorothea's condition worsened suddenly. Multiple organ failure, the doctors said. Her systems were simply giving out, one after another, like a machine that had run too long without maintenance, that had been pushed too hard for too many years. She died at 4:23 a.m. on January 18, 1960. Eleanor was there, holding her hand. Dorothea's last words, whispered so quietly Eleanor almost missed them, were, "You did well, sweetheart. So proud." Then she closed her eyes and stopped breathing, and the machinery of her exhausted body finally, mercifully, ceased. The funeral was on January 21, 1960, at Greenmount Cemetery. It was a small service. Perhaps 15 people attended. A few former co-workers from Dorothea's various clerical jobs. Mrs. Henderson from Monument Street, who'd watched Eleanor after school years ago. 2 professors from Johns Hopkins who'd known Theodore Haverford and remembered his daughter, Eleanor. The minister from a church Dorothea had occasionally attended but never joined. No one from Bethlehem Steel. No one from her engineering life. That chapter had ended 16 years ago, erased so completely it might never have existed. Eleanor stood by the grave as the minister read from Ecclesiastes, quote 63, and made herself a promise. Quiet, unspoken, witnessed only by her own conscience and her mother's plain casket being lowered into frozen January ground. She would find out what had happened. She would discover the truth. She would ensure it became known. Not vengeance. Vengeance was beneath dignity, beneath the standards her mother had maintained even in diminished circumstances. But truth. Truth told completely, carefully, irrefutably. Truth that would stand as testament and as warning. This became Eleanor's purpose for the next 19 years. The investigation began carefully, methodically, with the patience of someone who understood that truth takes time to excavate, that building an unassailable case requires foundation and structure and meticulous documentation. Eleanor started by collecting what little her mother had left: the box from Bethlehem Steel with its 3 technical books, the photograph, the compass, her Johns Hopkins diploma, a handful of old pay stubs from various jobs, and, found in a small envelope at the bottom of her mother's desk drawer, the termination letter from Bethlehem Steel, dated January 18, 1944, signed by Gerald Hutchinson, Director of Personnel. The letter was brief, bureaucratic, devastating. Dear Mrs. Haverford, we regret to inform you that your employment with Bethlehem Steel Corporation is terminated effective immediately due to inability to maintain security clearance required for your position. Final compensation will be forwarded to your address on file. Please return all company property. Sincerely, Gerald Hutchinson. No explanation, no appeal process, no recourse, just termination and the death of a career, delivered in 3 sentences. Eleanor filed this letter carefully, began building what would become an extensive archive. In 1960 and 1961, she established herself at the Baltimore Sun, working as a general assignment reporter covering city council meetings, neighborhood crime, local business. Competent work, professional, gaining the trust of editors and sources. In 1962, she was promoted to the Sun's investigative team, working on longer, more complex stories about municipal corruption, housing discrimination, industrial safety violations. She was learning her craft, learning how to research thoroughly, how to verify facts multiply, how to build cases that couldn't be dismissed or contradicted, learning patience. In 1963, she made her first formal inquiry into her mother's case. She wrote to the FBI under the provisions that allowed citizens to request information about themselves or deceased family members. The response, received 3 months later, was a form letter. __quote_65___. She tried Bethlehem Steel directly, requesting her mother's personnel file. Another denial. Employee records are confidential company property. Access limited to authorized personnel only. The doors were closed. The files were locked. The truth was buried under layers of classification and corporate policy. Eleanor didn't fight these denials directly. Fighting would have been futile. Instead, she began approaching from other angles, building knowledge of the systems themselves, understanding how wartime security investigations worked, what procedures were followed, what documentation was created, and where it might be filed. She researched the history of defense industry security programs, published a series of articles in 1964 about Baltimore's wartime industrial history, interviewing veterans of the shipyards, collecting oral histories. These articles mention nothing about her mother. They were ostensibly about celebrating Baltimore's contribution to victory. But they gave Eleanor access to people who'd worked at Bethlehem Steel in the 1940s, helped her understand the culture, the procedures, the relationships. In 1966, everything changed. Congress passed the Freedom of Information Act, signed into law by President Johnson on July 4th. For the first time, citizens had a legal right to request government records, with specific procedures for appeals and judicial review if agencies denied access. Eleanor immediately filed new FOIA requests to the FBI, to the Department of Defense, to every federal agency that might have records related to wartime security investigations at Bethlehem Steel. The first responses came in 1967. Most were still denied. But now the denials had to cite specific legal exemptions, had to explain why records couldn't be released. And some agencies, particularly ones whose records were old enough to no longer be considered sensitive, began releasing partial files. In 1969, Eleanor received her first significant breakthrough, a heavily redacted FBI file related to a 1943 to 1944 security investigation at Bethlehem Steel, Sparrows Point facility. The subject's name was blacked out, but the dates matched her mother's timeline exactly. The file contained interview summaries, background check reports, and references to __quote, _67 anonymous correspondence. Someone had written a letter. Someone had started this. Eleanor kept searching. Through the early 1970s, she continued filing FOIA requests, continued receiving partial releases, continued assembling fragments into a larger picture. In 1972, a former FBI clerk, retiring after 30 years of service, feeling more free to talk about old cases, mentioned to Eleanor during an interview for a different story that the Bureau had been declassifying wartime files as part of post-Watergate transparency initiatives. Quote 68, quote, he said. Quote 69, quote. Eleanor followed this lead carefully, submitted another FOIA request, this time specifically for, quote 70, quote. In April 1973, she received a package from the FBI, photocopies of several dozen documents, many heavily redacted, but some readable. Among them, a 3-page letter dated December 10, 1943, addressed to Bethlehem Steel Security. The author's name was blacked out, but the content was visible. The 3 accusations, the careful phrasing, the anonymous denunciation. Eleanor read this letter in her apartment, sitting at her kitchen table, and felt a cold clarity settle over her. This letter had killed her mother. Not literally, not directly, but truly. This letter had set in motion the machinery that had destroyed her mother's career, her health, her life. And someone had written it. Someone specific. Someone with a name. Someone who'd been alive and free and unpunished while Dorothea had worked herself to death in diminished circumstances. Eleanor photocopied the letter, filed it carefully, continued searching for the author's identity. The breakthrough came in 1976, in the most unexpected way, during an investigation that had nothing to do with her mother's case. Eleanor was covering a story about housing discrimination in East Baltimore, interviewing residents of a building being condemned through what appeared to be a racially motivated urban renewal scheme. During one of these interviews, she met Adelaide Farnsworth, a 74-year-old woman who'd lived in the building since 1952, who was being forced to relocate, who had stories to tell about half a century of Baltimore life. They talked for 2 hours in Adelaide's cluttered parlor, Eleanor taking notes about the current housing situation, Adelaide talking in the expansive way elderly people sometimes do when someone actually listens, moving from topic to topic, connecting present injustices to past ones. "Lot of injustice in this world," Adelaide said at one point. "Lot of people hurt other people for no good reason. I saw it all my working life. Worked at Bethlehem Steel during the war, you know. Drafting department. Terrible place in some ways. Lot of jealousy. Lot of backstabbing." Eleanor's attention sharpened. Eleanor asked carefully. Adelaide thought. Eleanor kept her voice neutral, professional. Adelaide shook her head. Eleanor's heart was pounding, but her reporter's training held. Adelaide paused. Eleanor said carefully. They talked for another hour. Adelaide had an excellent memory, could recall specific incidents, meetings, conversations from 32 years earlier. She remembered Constance's demeanor after Dorothea's termination, and the office gossip that had circulated quietly among those who'd understood what had happened. Eleanor thanked her, returned to the Sun's offices, began cross-referencing. She found Constance Elaine Ridgway in the Baltimore City Directory. Still alive, age 55, still in Baltimore. Widowed, Vernon had died in 1974. Living alone in Hampton, in the house they'd purchased in 1946. Found records of Constance's employment at Bethlehem Steel. Hired October 1940. Promoted to senior draftsman March 1944, 2 months after Dorothea's termination. Retired in 1965 with full pension. Found, through painstaking archive work at the Baltimore County Courthouse, property records, tax records, marriage certificates, building a profile. And finally, through a contact at the FBI willing to check old files off the record, a confirmation. In the original unredacted case file, stored in archives, the anonymous letter had been traced to a typewriter, an Underwood Standard model, registered to Vernon and Constance Ridgway at their Monument Street address in 1943. The FBI had known who wrote the letter, had known from the beginning, but hadn't prosecuted, hadn't revealed the author's identity, because anonymous denunciations weren't illegal, and the system had accepted them as patriotic civic duty. Eleanor had her proof, documentary evidence, witness testimony, circumstantial confirmation from multiple sources. She had everything she needed to expose Constance Ridgway, to destroy her reputation the way Constance had destroyed Dorothea's. She could have done it immediately, could have written the exposé, ruined Constance's comfortable old age, extracted a form of revenge. But Eleanor understood something her mother had taught through example rather than words. Revenge isn't justice. Revenge is just another form of destruction, another cruelty added to the world's accumulated store of cruelty. Justice requires something different, requires truth presented so completely, so irrefutably, that it speaks for itself without need for emotional embellishment. So Eleanor continued working, building the case, establishing context, making it unassailable. She spent 2 more years on research, interviewed 37 former Bethlehem Steel employees, obtained declassified documents from 6 different federal agencies, built a timeline spanning 1940 to 1944, cross-referenced against national events, policy changes, wartime security programs. Published preliminary articles about false denunciations generally, about lives destroyed by wartime paranoia, building a track record on the topic that established her credibility. Made contacts at the National Archives, at university libraries, at civil liberties organizations. Slowly assembled a network of sources and experts who could verify every fact, confirm every detail. And waited for the right moment. Because timing mattered. Published too early, and the story might be dismissed as personal vendetta. Published during the wrong political climate, and it might be buried or ignored. By late 1978, the moment had arrived. The country was still processing the aftermath of Watergate, still hungry for stories about government accountability and institutional wrongdoing. Congress was debating further reforms to FOIA. Public appetite for investigative journalism was strong. The Baltimore Sun's editors were supportive of serious, long-form investigative work. Eleanor wrote the article in January 1979. It took her 3 weeks to draft, revise, fact-check every detail with the Sun's legal team and research staff. The piece ran to 5,000 words, far longer than typical newspaper articles, but the editors agreed it warranted the space. The title, Echoes of Suspicion: How Wartime Fear Destroyed Innocent Lives. It was published on the front page of the Baltimore Sun's Sunday edition, February 11, 1979, above the fold, with a 2-column photograph of Bethlehem Steel's Sparrows Point facility during the war years. The article told the story chronologically, methodically. It described the atmosphere of 1943 America, the paranoia, the fear of sabotage, the government's encouragement of citizen vigilance that became citizen suspicion. Explained how defense industry workers were subjected to intensive background checks, how security clearances could be revoked based on minimal evidence, how denunciations were accepted and acted upon with little verification. It then focused on a specific case. __quote _87 __. It detailed the anonymous letter. 3 pages of accusations, all fabricated or distorted, submitted to corporate security in December 1943. Quoted extensively from the declassified FBI investigation file, showed how the machinery of suspicion processed these accusations through bureaucratic procedure, how an innocent person was terminated, blacklisted, destroyed professionally. It traced the aftermath: 16 years of diminished employment, of poverty, of illness, ending in early death in 1960. Described a life's potential completely wasted, a career ended, a family impoverished because someone wrote a letter. And then, carefully, using only public records and verified facts, it revealed the author. Through Freedom of Information Act requests and investigative research, this reporter has determined that the letter was written by a coworker who benefited directly from the victim's termination, receiving the promotion the victim had been given just weeks before. The author, a longtime Bethlehem Steel employee who retired with full pension and lived comfortably until recent years, never faced consequences, never admitted responsibility, never showed remorse. Eleanor didn't name Constance explicitly in the article itself. Didn't need to. The details were specific enough that anyone familiar with the case could identify her, but general enough to protect the Sun from libel claims. The article concluded, "This case exemplifies how systems designed to protect national security can be weaponized for personal gain, how procedural safeguards can fail to protect the innocent, how bureaucratic machinery can destroy lives while operating entirely within legal parameters. The engineer is dead now, unable to defend her reputation or reclaim her stolen career. But her story deserves to be told, not as a call for legal prosecution, the statute of limitations expired decades ago, but as historical truth, as warning, as testament to what happens when fear overcomes fairness and suspicion replaces evidence." It was signed by Eleanor R. Haverford, investigative reporter. The response was immediate and substantial. The Sun received hundreds of letters within the first week, some from former defense workers who'd witnessed similar situations, some from victims of loyalty investigations who'd never told their stories, some from FBI veterans who defended the wartime system, some from civil liberties advocates who praised the article's exposure of institutional failings. 3 book publishers contacted Eleanor within 10 days, interested in expanding the article into a full book about wartime denunciations. The article was reprinted in the Washington Post, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and several other major newspapers. It won the 1979 Maryland Press Association Award for investigative reporting. And one letter arrived at the Sun, handwritten, postmarked Baltimore, that simply read, __, quote _ 91 __, unsigned. But Eleanor knew who'd sent it. She read the letter once, filed it in her desk drawer with all the other documentation, continued her work at the Sun, where she'd been promoted to senior investigative reporter. Constance Elaine Ridgway never publicly responded to the article, but those who knew her, neighbors, fellow parishioners at Grace Methodist, her adult children, reported changes. She stopped attending church in March 1979 after several congregation members had clearly read the Sun article, had recognized the details, had begun treating her with cool distance. Stopped participating in neighborhood association meetings, stopped her weekly shopping trips to Hawkschild Cone, became reclusive, withdrawn. Her daughter Diane visited in May 1979, reportedly asked direct questions about the article. Constance denied everything, claimed it was all lies, insisted she'd never hurt anyone. Diane left unconvinced, began visiting less frequently. Her son Richard stopped calling after June. When neighbors asked about Constance's children, they received vague answers. __quote _92 ___. In 1982, at age 61, Constance was diagnosed with early-onset dementia. The progression was rapid, much faster than typical Alzheimer's, suggesting possible vascular dementia or other aggressive pathology. By 1983, she required daily assistance. By 1984, her children, dutiful if distant, placed her in a nursing facility in Catonsville. By 1986, she no longer recognized them when they visited. Sat in a wheelchair in the common room, staring at nothing, occasionally speaking fragments of sentences that made no sense, her memory completely destroyed by the disease's advance. She died on November 3, 1989, age 68, in the nursing home. The death certificate listed __quote _93 _ as the primary cause. The obituary in the Sun was 4 sentences: name, age, survived by children, funeral arrangements at Lausanne Funeral Home. The funeral was on November 6, 1989, a Monday morning. Perhaps 20 people attended, her children and their families, a few distant relatives, 3 women from church who came out of habit rather than affection. Eleanor learned of the death when a colleague at the Sun, checking obituaries as part of routine news scanning, saw the name and remembered the 1979 article. He sent Eleanor a copy of the obituary with a brief note, __quote _94 _ Eleanor read it at her desk, sat quietly for a moment, then folded the obituary, placed it in her desk file with all the other accumulated documentation from the case, and returned to work on her current investigation, a series about lead paint poisoning in East Baltimore housing projects. She didn't attend the funeral, didn't send flowers or a condolence card, didn't mark the death in any way except filing the obituary for her records. Because Eleanor understood that her work was complete. The truth had been told. The record had been corrected. Constance Ridgway's comfortable anonymity had been stripped away, her secret exposed, her reputation, such as it was in her final years, destroyed not by revenge but by facts, documented and irrefutable. The punishment, if it could be called that, hadn't been Eleanor's doing. It had been the natural consequence of truth colliding with lies, of light entering darkness. Eleanor had simply been the instrument. As her mother had been an instrument of precision in engineering, Eleanor had been an instrument of precision in journalism. Different tools, same principle. Measure carefully, calculate exactly, execute without error. Eleanor Haverford continued working in journalism until her retirement in 1995 at age 55, after 36 years at the Baltimore Sun. Over those decades, she wrote extensively about institutional wrongdoing, about lives damaged by bureaucratic systems, about the distance between legal procedures and actual justice, about ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. Her colleagues said her best work was always about small injustices and quiet heroism, about individuals destroyed without headlines, about dignity maintained in impossible circumstances, about the difference between what's legal and what's right. She won 4 more Maryland Press Association awards, was twice a Pulitzer finalist, mentored 2 generations of investigative reporters at the Sun. But she never wrote another article about her mother, never explained to younger colleagues what the 1979 piece had really meant. never revealed the personal stakes. If someone mentioned quote 95 and people did occasionally, as it had become something of a classic in journalism schools, she'd respond briefly, standard investigative work, archive research and FOIA requests. Nothing special about the methodology. The photograph of her mother remained on her desk throughout her career. Dorothea at the drafting table at Bethlehem Steel, 1942. Ruler and compass nearby. Slight smile, the one that showed engagement, focus, the pleasure of competent work well done. Eleanor looked at it every day. Thought about inheritance, not money or property, but habits of mind. Her mother had taught her precision through example, taught her to complete work properly, to maintain standards regardless of circumstances, to value truth over comfort, taught her that dignity wasn't about circumstances but about choices, about how you conducted yourself when the world was unfair. Sometimes, usually late at night when the newsroom was quiet, when Eleanor was alone working on a complicated story, she thought about justice. Not the official kind discussed in courts and legislation, but the other kind. Slow, patient justice that moves by its own timeline, that requires waiting for the right conditions, that comes not from anger but from truth carefully assembled and clearly presented. Her mother had endured 16 years of injustice. Eleanor had waited 19 years for the right moment to correct the record. That was the price. Not revenge, just the cost of doing it right. Of building a case so thoroughly documented that it couldn't be dismissed or forgotten. There's history, and there's what remains when history ends, when the participants are gone, when only artifacts and documents survive to testify. From Dorothea Millicent Haverford remained a black and white photograph on her daughter's desk. Several folders of engineering calculations from Bethlehem Steel, preserved in Maritime Museum archives, contributing to Liberty ship designs that helped win the war. A Johns Hopkins diploma in Eleanor's possession. A leather compass case with her father's initials, still containing the brass compass she'd used daily until January 1944. Remained handwriting, careful, precise, right-slanted script that Eleanor recognized in her own handwriting and thought, this is inheritance, not things or money. Habits of precision, standards of accuracy, refusal to lie even when truth costs everything. From Constance Elaine Ridgway remained. In Baltimore Sun archives, Eleanor's complete research file. 36 manila folders containing declassified FBI documents, interview transcripts, timeline reconstructions, photocopies of the anonymous denunciation letter. And the published article. February 11th, 1979, front page. Permanently archived, available to anyone who searches the Sun's historical records. No name on that letter, but the facts unmistakable. No explicit accusation in the article, but the truth clear to anyone who reads carefully. As justice should work, quietly, precisely, irreversibly. Baltimore, Maryland. Monument Street, where the Ridgways and Haverfords once lived as neighbors, where Constance wrote her letter, where Dorothea received her termination notice, where Eleanor grew up watching her mother diminish year by year. The building was demolished in 1983 as part of urban renewal. Current residents scattered to other neighborhoods, other cities. The physical traces dissolved into a new era that had no knowledge of what happened in Apartment 7 and Apartment 12, on the stairs between them, in the cold winter of 1943 to 1944. But it happened. All of it happened. And the black and white photograph, woman at drafting table, ruler in hand, engaged in competent work, showing the slight smile of someone doing what they're good at, still exists somewhere. In Eleanor's apartment, or in the possession of Eleanor's own children if she had any, or donated to an archive, or stored in a box waiting for someone to discover it. Such things don't disappear entirely. They wait. In drawers, in archives, in memory, waiting for someone to open them, to see what they contain, to understand what they mean. Waiting for someone to remember that truth matters, that precision matters, that completing the work properly matters, even when it takes 16 years or 19 years or a lifetime. waiting to remind us that justice delayed isn't always justice denied. Sometimes, it's just justice being assembled carefully, piece by piece, fact by fact, until the moment arrives when it can finally speak clearly. And when it speaks forever.